It began the night Ellie Harper first heard her dead fiancé's voice whispering through the rain. She had moved to the fog-drenched edges of Rainier, Oregon, trying to escape the dual grief of losing him in a tragic crash, and her mother just weeks later. Hoping the forest silence would numb her pain, she found an old rental cottage buried in the woods. So cheap it felt like a trap. Locals avoided the area and spoke in warnings. No one stays past the second storm. The first week lulled her into calm, but then the rain came. Constant, cold and strange. It whispered through the windows and tapped in patterns like it was trying to speak. At night, Ellie heard voices in the forest calling her name, and then calling someone else's, her fiancé's. Things inside the house shifted. Furniture scraped floors on its own. Her reflection in the mirror blinked out of sync, and the old grandfather clock began ticking backward, always between 2:41 and 2:47 a.m. Her audio recordings captured something terrifying. During that exact time frame, the rain would vanish into dead silence, replaced by muffled breathing and a woman sobbing beneath the sound of water. One night, compelled by something she couldn't explain, Ellie wandered barefoot into the woods and found a stone circle buried beneath the roots of a twisted oak. Standing at its center was a soaking wet man in a ruined black suit, her fiancé, unmoving, with lifeless eyes and his mouth slightly parted as though caught mid-scream. When she turned to run, the forest shifted. Trees were in the wrong places. The path was gone. And before she passed out, she heard her mother's voice, soft and broken. "He made the deal. Now it's your turn." The next morning, Ellie woke in bed, dry, unharmed, but wrong. Her skin was cracked like dried paper. Her voice sounded unfamiliar, and the rain hadn't stopped. That night, every mirror in the house reflected not her own face, but her mother's, pale, soaked, screaming silently, mouthing one word: traded. Each passing night, Ellie sees less of herself and more of someone else. Whatever followed her from that stone circle is still watching, waiting for the third storm, and this time, it won't leave without her. It was the summer of 2011 when 26-year-old Elena Brooks moved into a cheap one-bedroom apartment on the outskirts of Bridgewater, Massachusetts. A quiet town with more trees than people, and a history no one liked to talk about. Elena had just gone through a brutal breakup, was in debt, and needed isolation to heal. The apartment was old, cold, and had a strange slant to its hallway. But rent was low and the neighbors minded their business. For the first 2 nights, she barely slept. Not because of grief, but because of the ticking. A faint, rhythmic tick, tick, tick came from inside her closet every night at exactly 2:11 a.m., like the sound of a metronome wrapped in wet fabric. The third night, she finally opened the closet to check. There was nothing, just an old floorboard, slightly loose, and a strange black stain on the wall. But the moment she shut the door, she heard it again, louder, faster. She tried recording it, but her phone froze at 2:11 a.m. every time. Then came the drawings. Little charcoal sketches would appear on her kitchen counter, always at night, always childlike. A woman with long hair and no face, standing in a crooked hallway. The last sketch showed that same faceless woman, standing over Elena while she slept. When she reported it to the landlord, he hesitated, then simply said, "You're in Unit 3C? You should have asked about the closet." She pressed for answers, but he only warned, "Don't open it at 2:11. That's when she remembers." The following week, Elena began hearing whispers from the hallway, not in English, but in a warped, stretched-out voice that somehow sounded wet. Then during a thunderstorm, the power went out. The only thing still working was her old wall clock, which struck 2:11 a.m. and stopped. Elena, half asleep and terrified, turned toward the closet, and it was open. Not wide, just a sliver. Enough to see a pale, long hand resting against the frame. When she approached, the door swung open violently, and inside was nothing but a tunnel. Deep, dark, lined with crooked wooden boards and soaked in what smelled like mold and iron. She never called the police. Instead, she placed her phone on record, set it by the closet, and left town the next morning. But that phone was found months later, in a thrift store 5 states away. When investigators checked the footage, It ended at 2:11 a.m., with a single frame of a pale face. No eyes, no mouth, just skin pressed against the lens, and her whisper barely audible. She opened it for me. In November 2007, a 34-year-old school teacher named Daniel Mercer inherited a small lakeside cabin in Oregon from an uncle he barely remembered. A man who had lived off-grid and died mysteriously, his body found floating in the lake with eyes wide open and fingernails torn. Daniel, emotionally exhausted after a recent divorce and desperate for solitude, saw it as a chance to escape, recharge, and possibly write the book he had been putting off for years. The cabin was rustic but beautiful, surrounded by thick fog and silent woods, with a narrow dock leading out onto the still, black lake. On the second night, Daniel began hearing a splash, exactly 3 splashes, at 3:03 a.m. He assumed it was wildlife until the third night, when he saw footprints on the dock, small, barefoot, and wet, leading from the water to his front door. He searched the lake's edge the next morning, but found nothing but reeds and the vague scent of sulfur. He brushed it off until he found the tape recorder. It was hidden beneath the cabin floorboards, wrapped in old plastic and labeled, "Do not play after sunset." Curiosity overrode fear. That night, Daniel played it. The tape began with static, then soft breathing, followed by the desperate voice of a man, whispering warnings. It comes back when it's remembered. Don't think about her eyes. Don't look at the water when it speaks your name. Then came a sound, not human, not animal, wet, gurgling, and impossibly close. From that night on, Daniel's reflection in the lake began behaving differently. It moved slower, blinked later, and once didn't appear at all. Then the dreams began. Nightmares of a woman crawling from the lake, bloated, hair tangled in weeds, eyes pitch black, speaking backwards. Daniel began boarding up the windows, stacking furniture against the doors. But on the 7th night, at exactly 3:03 a.m., he woke to water dripping from the ceiling and the sound of footsteps, slow, wet, and wrong, inside the cabin. He hid in the crawl space, clutching the tape recorder, and pressed play again. This time it wasn't a warning, it was a plea. If you're hearing this, it's too late. The lake remembers who listens. It's in your head now. That was the last anyone heard from Daniel. When police arrived days later, the cabin was empty. No signs of struggle, no damage. Just a trail of wet footprints leading to the dock. His clothes were folded neatly at the edge, and in the middle of the lake, right beneath the water, something pale floated just out of reach, watching, waiting. And when they fished out the tape recorder from the shore, it only had one thing recorded on loop. You looked. You listened. Now she remembers you too.